Christmas isn't complete without a delicious Christmas turkey. This stunning bird will be sure to wow the guests at your next holiday party. Preparing it may seem daunting, but fear not. If you follow my simple instructions, it will be as easy as 1, 2, 3.
It's out. Forget the turkey.
It's coming, isn't it? And some of you are looking at that going, that was from my house. How did they get that video? What happened? How did they get in my house? Welcome to North Shore Community Church. So glad that you're joining us as we kick off this December series, as we kind of prepare for the Christmas season together. I want to welcome those of you who are joining us online. So glad that you're with us as well. But before we jump into this message, I want to start with just a little bit of church family update for you. I don't know about you, but 2017 has been a pretty big year for me and for my family. A year ago, I wasn't a parent. I wasn't living in Washington State. I wasn't on staff at North Shore. I wasn't massively vitamin D deficient. And a lot has happened in our life over the past year. And a lot has happened in the life of this church over the past year. Just a few kind of highlights for you. Just about a year ago, January of 2017, Arbor Church was planted from this church. And I had a chance to meet with Jake, the pastor, a couple weeks ago. And I know that church is doing really wonderfully well. About 500 people involved there. Beans and Rice campaign this year, where over $100,000 was raised. This year at Community Serve Day in August, we served 24 schools with 27 different partner churches and over 2,500 people involved in that effort. And week after week, as I've been here, I've just seen amazing faithfulness to ministry. From groups to kids to students. In fact, this past week, the student ministry gathered for their very first Friendsgiving experience. I think we had a little picture of all the folks in our kind of recently updated student center. And by the way, notice, no one's on their cell phone. Now, for students, to have that happen in student ministry is like turning water into wine, and that's a miracle in and of itself. And there's been a lot of change over last year. Anyone notice there's been some change around the church last year? Yep, you've had a number of changes, including a senior pastor transition, and not just a new senior pastor, but someone from 49er country. So clearly this is a miracle of God that we're here. And what's so amazing, and what I just want to encourage you this morning with, is that you have been so faithful. You've continued to serve and give and invite and bless and encourage. You've showed up early, you've stayed late, and as a church, you've continued to give financially with such amazing generosity. One of the most just such a cool thing for our family as we came to this church was just to see the track record of just financial integrity and generosity and sacrificial giving that goes along in this community, from the church planning to the compassion fund that you heard about this morning to 15% of our operational budget going out into mission to bless others in the world. And by the way, that kind of stuff is not the norm in churches today. I don't know if you know that. That's not just the norm in church practice today. That's just unique, and it's an amazing picture of the generosity of this place. And I just want to catch you up a little bit on where we stand financially in our budget for the year. Just so you know, last year we approved as a church a budget of approximately $4.85 million for our church budget for the year. And right now, we're just about 5% behind our target for where we want to be. About $230,000 behind, which, given over 10% of this church going out to help launch Arbor Church and a senior pastor transition, I think is really good news. I think it's actually really good news. I don't want you to be alarmed by that number. I think it's really good news. In fact, our staff, even better news, has been so faithful with their stewardship. The expenses are down this year, so there's no looming crisis. There's no impending kind of, difficult things coming along that front. So I just wanted to encourage you with that. And just to say, if you're thinking about giving at the end of the year, I just want to encourage you to be praying about generosity and our church. I believe God was part of the process of setting our budget for this year, last year, and He knew all that was going to happen, from the church plant to the senior pastor transition to all those things. So we'll be sending out an email this week just with a little bit of a kind of an update on ministry for the year and where all the resources have been going. But I just want to ask you to pray about how God might be leading you to give this particular year, and to remind you that your generosity is making a huge difference. So that's kind of one update on the church family front. The other request I have for you is to partner with us in our Christmas and Christmas Eve experience. We talked last week about God's heart for all people, and Christmas really is a chance for us as a church to really just share that love and that good news with everyone who would come through our doors. And two ways you can be part of this. One, and first, is to bring someone to Christmas Eve who needs God. Just to take a risk to bring someone, it could be a friend, a family member, a colleague, but to bring someone with you on Christmas Eve who needs God. We have invitations on your chair that you can use to invite people. We've got a candy cane station outside if you want to drop a candy cane on that, because people love sugar. And just think about who you might want to bring. And just so you know, this year at Christmas Eve, we're going to be giving away a book, one book per family, that we'll be using to help kind of guide us through our January sermon series. So there'll be a connection to Christmas Eve, to the ministry that's going to be happening here in January. And if you want to know a book, you're going to have to come on Christmas Eve. So, but that's just a reminder to encourage you to be bold in who you might want to bring with you. And the second part of Christmas Eve is to serve. If North Shore is your church home, if you call this place home, I want to encourage you, I want to ask you to attend a service and to serve at a service. The reason why we scheduled them all afternoon between 2:30 and 6:30, kind of close together, was to ease the burden of for those of you who want to attend and serve. In terms of just being part of that, we know that there will be more guests in this place, on this campus, that day, more guests that day than any other day of the year. And so we want to be just a place where it's just an amazing amount of hospitality, from the parking lot to the kids' spaces to the hot chocolate bar. There's a place on the top of your Connect card. If you're interested in serving, you can just check that card and someone will email you about opportunities where we can, as a family, welcome those who will be coming to take part of Christmas Eve with us on that day. So, and just kind of extra plus on that, if you serve on Christmas Eve, it gives you like 1 extra hour and a half to be away from your in-laws. So it's good news for everybody if you need it. Give, bring, serve. Why? Because God is still in the business of changing lives. I got an email this past week from someone who's been a follower of Jesus for about 3 weeks, who's been coming to our church, just expressing her heart, wow, God's doing so much in my life. I have so much to learn, so much to grow in, and God's doing it through you in this place. So be encouraged. Now, to jump into the message in the series this week, we're starting this new series called Who Needs Christmas? Who Needs Christmas? And I just got to say at the beginning, don't get me wrong, I love Christmas. I start listening to Christmas music usually around July. So I'm kind of a Christmas person, but for a lot of people, Christmas can be kind of a hard season. It can be filled with stress and shopping and scheduling and family tensions and people kind of asking questions about their own personal life, and there's travel chaos. Anyone ever have travel chaos around the holidays? I kind of have this pattern in my life of kind of holiday of travel chaos. You'll probably hear the stories over the years. Just some years ago, before I was married, I was scheduled to fly to see my family in Little Rock, Arkansas on Christmas Day. And I emphasized the word schedule because there was a massive winter storm kind of moving through the U.S. South. But I felt confident I would make it home. I thought, wouldn't the same loving God who calmed the storm on the Sea of Galilee help me, but a humble pastor, make his way home for Christmas Day? And so I boarded my flight. We changed planes in Phoenix. We head out to Arkansas. And by the time we got to Arkansas, the snowstorm was so massive that we began to just circle above the clouds, literally for hours, because we couldn't land. And we circled for several hours until the pilot came on and said, hey, we're running out of fuel. We've got to fly back to Dallas, land, refuel, and then fly back. I thought, well, gosh, that's not going to make for a great Christmas night. So we landed in Dallas, we refueled, and then we waited and waited and waited and waited until sometime after midnight when they decided to cancel our flight. So I got off the plane, got in this long line to figure out how to get onto a next flight for the next day, got on, was lucky enough to get on a flight that was scheduled to leave at 4:30 in the morning. Now, the good news is that was only 4 hours away. The bad news is that was only 4 hours away, okay? So there was no time to get to a hotel or get to sleep or rest. So I'm walking through the airport and then I see this sign that I hadn't had food in forever. I just see this sign that just brought tears to my eyes, Cinnabon. One of the great proofs of the existence of God, Cinnabon right there. But of course it was closed, just like the rest of the airport was at 12:30. So I ended up down by baggage claim, huddled up next to my suitcase where I spent Christmas night by myself in the airport in Dallas. only to wake up after about an hour of sleep to get up, go board this plane or go through security, get on the same plane that I had flown in on. We fly to Arkansas, we land, and it's this beautiful white winter wonderland, and they gotten like 8 inches of snow, which is very unusual with that part of the world. And I thought for a moment, wow, it was really worth it. I mean, look at this amazing scenery, except for the fact that the snow was so severe that the trees that were lining my family street fell into the road. I think we have a picture of what that looked like. This is my family street. So notice there's no car tracks. There's only footprints on this street. My dad had to walk down this hill, down a mile, to borrow someone's truck, pick me up at the airport, drive back to the bottom of the hill where the last touch of my wonderful Christmas was walking up the hill with my suitcase in 8 inches of snow. And I'm thinking to myself, who needs Christmas? And maybe there's part of the season that brings stress or worry or fear or a sense of expectation or not met expectations to your life. I mean, Christmas, it kind of makes people go a little bit loopy at times. I just read about one shopper who was so excited to purchase his new 50-inch TV that he found it, he bought it, he drove home, and only to realize that he'd left his 2-year-old child at the store. Someone actually asked me if that was me, and I said, of course not. It would take a way larger television for me to leave my kid at the store. For more and more people, Christmas is filled with this sense of stress or pressure or expectation. In fact, according to a recent poll, I'm not making this up, 45% of Americans said they would rather just skip Christmas altogether. Meaning, let's just go from Thanksgiving to New Year's and just bypass all of it. Why? Well, I don't think it's just because we're busy. I mean, life is filled with busy seasons. And I don't think it's just because family can bring drama. Family can always bring drama. I don't think it's just the shopping or the stress. I actually think it's about silence. Now, some of you are thinking, well, what are you talking about? Christmas is like the least silent time of the year. Well, I'm not talking about physical silence. I'm talking about a sense of God's silence. I'm talking about a season that's supposed to be filled with joy and wonder, where hearts are merry and bright, so to speak, right? We know all the songs, all the language, and yet for so many people, it's a season that brings up these questions like, well, where was God when I needed him this year? Or why didn't God answer that prayer for me? Or why has God not shown up? Why has there been this difficult circumstance or situation? Or what about that job that didn't go well, that relationship that didn't go well? What about that disappointment? Have you ever found yourself wondering, God, where were you this year? God, why didn't you show up for me this year? God, why are you so silent? And it's not just the waiting that's difficult. It's not knowing how long, right? In fact, research will show that people can wait for extensive periods of time if they know how long. It's why there's countdown clocks at subway stations, or you take a number at the DMV, because people will tolerate almost any length of time if they know just how long. And some of you, you're going to experience a very real life version of this Christmas. You're going to be sitting in your car on Christmas Eve, think about going inside the in-laws' house, and you're going to be thinking about this question that you so desperately want to ask your spouse, but I recommend you not asking. But you're going to be thinking to yourself, oh my goodness, if you'll just tell me how long do we have to stay? I mean, I can be social, I can be friendly, but just tell me how long. Again, free pastor advice, you don't need to ask that question. Just smile and go in and enjoy it. The real pain of waiting is not just the waiting, it's not knowing how long. In our spiritual lives and our life with God, the real pain of waiting or wondering or asking questions is not just the waiting, it's not knowing how long. Whether it's in a relationship or about reconciliation with a loved one or about a difficult circumstance or healing from pain or addiction or worry, in life, there's no countdown clock. There's no taking a number. You don't know if the answer is going to come tomorrow or next month or next year. And so we're left wondering, and in season, it can bring up this question, how long? How long? For so many people, Christmas. In fact, studies show that the rates of depression and insecurity can kind of spike this time of year. People asking themselves, how long? How long? Psalmist put it this way. I love this line. My soul is deep in anguish. How long, Lord? How long? It's a biblical question. I recently read a story about a woman named Melanie who lost her newborn baby while giving birth. And it's an unspeakable loss regardless of the circumstances, but this was particularly tragic for Melanie and her husband. You see, early in her life, she'd been diagnosed with this condition that the doctor said made her basically unable to get pregnant. And then after years of trying, they finally got pregnant, and they celebrated this as a miracle. But then when they lost their baby, that miracle became a tragedy. And according to Melanie, God simply just went silent on her. There was no new word from the Lord, no miraculous healing. And she described what happened to her faith this way. Listen to her words. This is what she said. I used to be a fired up Christian who poured herself into her faith, but now I feel nothing towards God. My husband and I used to be so close, but now we're almost strangers. Church used to seem so exciting, but now it bores me to death. I used to love to read the Bible and pray, but now I find both laborious and aggravating. I just feel dead. Maybe you've got a story, something like that, or maybe your story's a little different, but you know the tension, you know these questions. If you're really honest, you know these sorts of questions in life. And by the way, you're not alone. This happened to men and women throughout history, throughout Scripture. There's a man in the Bible named Job who lost his family, his health, his livelihood. Listen to what he said to God. He said these words, I cry out to you, God, but you do not answer. I stand up, but you merely look at me. In other words, you're just silent. See, he's not doubting the existence of doubt. He's doubting the existence of God. He's doubting the goodness of God. He's not thinking, God, are you out there? He's thinking, God, do you even care? Are you going to show up? What's with all the silence? Which brings us to Christmas, which brings us to this story that in spite of all the holiday tradition and fanfare and fun, and there's lots of goods that go along with kind of the holiday tradition, the story of Christmas, the real Christmas, is good news for people who are mad at God or fed up with God or disappointed at God or waiting on God, because Christmas is about what God has been doing when God seems silent. If you want to know what's the heart of this Christmas story, what's it really about? It's a story that reckons on us this amazing truth about what God has been doing when it seems like God has been absent from our lives. Many of you know the Bible is divided into two parts, two testaments it's called, the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament ends with this book called Malachi, a prophetic book. And the New Testament begins with a book called Matthew, which begins with the story of Jesus' birth. But what you may not know is in that one turn of a page, that one little turn that takes you 1 second to move, that one page represents over 400 years of history. 400 years between Malachi's final words and Matthew's first words. In that time, no gospel was announced, no new word from the Lord was revealed, no scriptures were inspired. For 400 years, God went silent. And that was about 10 seconds. Now just imagine day after day, year after year, decade after decade, century after century, people praying, God, where are you? God, what are you doing? God, why don't you answer? That's the context for Christmas. The context for Christmas is not, sales and shopping. The context for Christmas is centuries of silence and wondering and questions and doubt. Heard one pastor put it this way: the Christmas story is not about one silent night, it's about something that happens after 400 years of silent nights. Friends, if this is you, if this is part of your story, if you feel like, gosh, everyone that goes to church, their lives are going great and they look happy and they seem all fine, if this is part of your story, you are not alone. And I'm so glad you're here, because Christmas is really for you. After 400 years, something really remarkable happened. A baby named Jesus was born in this town called Bethlehem. Listen to what happened. This is from the Gospel of Luke chapter 2. Luke writes, and there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. Something that had happened night after night, year after year, decade after decade, just minding their own business. And then a messenger of the Lord, an angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. Who wouldn't be? But the angel said, do not be afraid. I bring you good news of great joy that will be for everybody. Today, in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you. He is the Messiah, the Lord, and this will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger. Christmas, you see, breaks the silence. But it does more. It helps us understand the silence. It helps us understand what God has been doing. Christmas reminds us that God's silence does not mean God is absent. It reminds us that God's silence does not mean God has been absent. And the reason we know that is something the angel said. They use this phrase, this will be the sign. Now that may not sound like a big deal. You may gloss over that kind of phrase. This was loaded language in that day. It points back over 700 years to a prophet named Isaiah who wrote this about the coming of the Messiah. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. What's the sign? The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and you'll call him this amazing name, Emmanuel, which means God with us. The word El is a great Hebrew word for God. Emmanuel, God with us. You see, Isaiah is reminding them, or Christmas is basically telling us not something new about God, but confirming what has been true all along, even though we couldn't see it, that God is with you. Even when you can't see it, even when you're not sure, even when he seems silent, Christmas is the story. The sign that you get is this baby in a manger in a remote part of the world that seemed to go so unnoticed, that was telling the story of this God who chooses to be with you. Not the God who remains above, not the God who is around, God with us. Sometimes I think people will think of Christmas as kind of this moment in history where God kind of corrects something about himself. Like God's kind of been distant and angry and frustrated at people until he finally decides that he's kind of fed up and had enough, and then he sends Jesus to kind of save us and put us on our way. No. Christmas came to show us, Jesus came to show us the true nature of God, the true character of God. God with us, who he's been all along. Some of you have written off God as a kind of absentee landlord. He shows up here and there just to see how clean the apartment is and to collect his rent, so to speak. But no. When you need him, he's nowhere to be found, or so you think. But the angel tells this different story. Jesus has come to remind us that even in the darkness, even as we wait, there's a sign of who God really is, Emmanuel, God with us. God's silence does not mean God is absent. And some of you need this in your work or your marriage or in that question, that situation, that place where there's pain or disappointment, and you're wondering, God, are you there? God is with you. In fact, this sign tells us that God is up to something even bigger, even greater than even if we can't see it yet. For 400 years, people were wondering, where is God? But God was up to something even better behind the scenes, ready to come at just the right moment. Christmas reminds us that God's silence doesn't mean he's absent. It also reminds us that God's silence does not mean that he's not at work. God's silence does not mean that God is not actively at work in your life. It may be that you just can't see it yet. A friend of mine told me a story about a woman named Carol. And within a span of a year in her life, Carol lost 2 close friends to suicide. And naturally, she was devastated. So she began to pray, God, just would you use me in someone's life? Use me in someone's life that could use just a friend or encouragement so something like this doesn't happen again. A few weeks later, Carol was making a phone call and she dialed the wrong number, and she actually called a woman on the East Coast accidentally. And Carol didn't think much of the conversation. The woman sounded a little bit distraught, so they talked for a little bit and shared a little conversation. The woman's name was Sue, and at the end of the conversation, Sue said, hey, can we talk again sometime? And Carol said, sure. And so they talked again, and then again, and then again. They actually talked every week for over a year about life and love and work and family, and eventually Carol shared with Sue her faith in this person named Jesus, this God who is with us. About a year later, Carol had a business trip to the East Coast, and so she decided to meet up with her friend Sue, and they had dinner. They got to dinner, and Sue began to tell Carol that about a year earlier she had been lonely and devastated, that she actually had gotten in her car and was driving to a bridge to take her own life, but she ran out of gas along the way and had to get help with her car, and she got taken back home, and she sat there isolated and lonely, feeling helpless, and guess what? That's when her phone rang. And it was a wrong number named Carol. And she began to tell Carol how throughout that year, God had been using her to bring encouragement and meaning and purpose, and eventually that she had actually committed her life, devoted her life to Jesus. For a year, Carol had conversations on the phone, not ever seeing or knowing what God was really doing. She couldn't see it. She didn't have eyes to see it. There were no revelations or inspired words from the Lord. She was just on the phone having these conversations, but God was at work, you see. God's always at work, you see. Behind the scenes, when you're not noticing. I love how a writer named Ben Patterson describes this truth. He writes, "What we see God doing is never as good as what we don't see." We see God do some amazing things, but what we see God doing is never as good as what we don't see. And some of you need to pause and just let this sink in a little bit. Because you've been measuring God's faithfulness in your life by things that you can see. But what we see God doing is never as good as we don't see. Just think about the resurrection of Jesus. No one actually saw Jesus' body coming out of that tomb, coming back to life. People saw the cross. They saw Jesus be put in the grave. They saw his resurrected body later when he was alive and well. But the most amazing miracle of all time, Jesus coming back to life, nobody saw it. Why? What we see God doing is never as good as what we don't see. God's got bigger plans and better plans and more in store. Some of you have been waiting for God to show up. You've been praying and praying and praying, and you're not sure God is listening, and you can't see any evidence of it yet. God is at work. You just can't see it. Some of you have been grieving this year and hurting this year. Maybe it was the end of a relationship or the loss of a loved one, and you're discouraged and you can't see the way forward. God is at work. You just can't see it yet. Some of you have a friend or a loved one in your life that just is maybe cold towards God or doesn't care about God, and you just feel like there's no way they're going to change. There's no way God is at work in them. You just can't see it yet. Some of you have a friend or loved one who's struggling or suffering right now. I have a close friend who's struggling in their health right now, and it's so hard for me to imagine that God is at work, but Christmas tells us, the story tells us, Jesus coming tells us that God is at work even if you can't see. Isn't that good news? Don't we need that? I need that. I need to be reminded that it's not just about what I see. Christmas tells me that God's got a plan. He's got a purpose. He's up to something, even if my human eyes can't detect it. Even if my logic and wisdom can't parse it out. I love how the prophet Isaiah put it. He said, or he wrote, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways." I used to think that kind of sounded sort of condescending, like God saying, like, look at me, look at how smart I am, but it's just the opposite. God is saying, you can trust me. In the silence, in the darkness, in the waiting, in the doubt, you can trust me. My ways are above your ways. My work is above your work. When all your logic and all your reasoning has run out, when all the evidence says there's no way and there's no hope, Christmas came. Jesus came. Good news came. Salvation came. And this applies to all of us, no matter how broken or shameful you may feel. Some of you may feel like, you know why God is silent in my life is because he's just given up on me. Maybe you think you're kind of too far gone, not worth the effort. But look at who was given the first news of Christmas. It wasn't scholars or religious scribes or all the really good people out there. Angel came to shepherds. People who in that day were considered unclean, outcast, outsiders, untrusted. People who were tempted to think the reason God is silent is because I'm beyond saving. But that's couldn't be further from the truth. And those shepherds were not just given a sign, they were given a promise. The angel said, you will find him. Remember that line? You will find him. See, this Christmas, you can still find him. You can still find him. In the darkness, in the doubt, in the questions, in the discouragement, in that difficult circumstance. You can still find him no matter how far from God you feel, no matter how silent the nights may seem. You can find him right here, right now. Why? Because Jesus is God with us. And that's the good news of Christmas. Let me pray. Jesus, we live through many silent nights, navigating difficult questions about you and what you're doing, what we can see, what we can't see. And so I pray for those in this room especially who are asking those questions and may be afraid to say it in church, that they're not sure that you're there, they're not sure that you care. God, remind us that the Christmas story is about all that you've been doing when you've seemed so silent. It's about the work that you do that's better than we could imagine. We just can't see it yet. It's about the way you turn stories of questions and wondering and silence into new life and new birth and new joy. Jesus, we want to receive you right now because you came into the world to find us. We want to find you right now because we need you so much, even if we've got questions. And so I pray for every brother and sister right now that in this moment they take a little step of trusting you, that they just open their hands. You can just open your hands and say, Jesus, I want to trust you a little more. I want to trust you with this question. I want to trust you with this sense of silence. Jesus, speak to us. Show up for us. Be present with us as the God with us. And we're so grateful for the Christmas story. How silently that wondrous gift was given. Jesus, you are the great gift in our lives. And we pray in this moment that you would be present for us. And we pray this in your name. Amen.